This lesson in our fiction narrative unit focuses on setting, including the wheres, whens, whats, and whys. So by the end of this lesson, you will be able to define setting, list and define the elements of setting, including time, place, and culture, explain the importance of setting to narratives, and explain how to use sensory details and showing, not telling, to incorporate setting into a narrative. So your keywords are setting, place, time, and culture, sensory details, imagery, and showing, not telling. Hey Jane, how's your day been? Hi Jim, it's been great. How about yours? What's the matter with this picture, guys? That's right, we got a couple of voices and nothing else. This doesn't change any if we add some characters in there. Now we can see what our characters look like, but they're literally floating around in a void of nothing. They're in a void of nothing, nowhere. Your story needs a place to exist. Setting is important not just to know, but also to describe and share with your readers so you don't end up with floating talking heads like we just did on this slide. Consider this example from The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. We immediately know that where we are at is in a hole in the ground. We additionally know that this is not the type of hole that we would normally think of. It's not going to be dirty and wet and filled with worms, and it's not dry or sandy. We have the one last detail that this hole means comfort, with the implication that it's got some furnishing, places to sit, and food to eat. This is setting. Quite simply, setting is where the story happens, its place, for each and every individual scene, as well as the overall. So your story might be set in California, Missouri, but then it will then have several smaller settings of California Middle School and Mrs. Elliott's room and the next room and the next room and the next room. This is what happens, okay? Time is when the story happens. It might be in the past, the present, the future, and alternate history, but there needs to be a sense of time, and that time needs to move with the character. So if your story starts on a Monday morning, throughout the story's description, if it's the course of a day, we will see time move forward by the hours. If it's taking weeks and months, something's going to give the reader that cue that time is moving forward and by how much. Setting will also involve culture. This is quite simply the habits, traditions, and beliefs, religious, political, social, holidays, heroes, etc., that a group of people in an area has. So if your story were talking about our recent Spirit Week, it would be talking about our tradition of Red Ribbon Week. It would be talking about the types of spirit days we hold. It would be talking about how the students interact with this information, etc. One thing to note is that in a man versus self conflict, you often end up with an internal setting in terms of the character's thoughts and feelings in addition to the physical setting. So like with Telltale Heart, where the story took place presumably with the narrator in a mental hospital or an interrogation room, as well as the old man's apartment, there's also the internal setting of the narrator's insanity going on with this particular story. So, how do we build a setting? We use imagery. We need to use words to draw our reader a picture, because if we don't tell our reader where they are going to be very confused and you're going to have some floating heads. Imagery depends on sensory details. These are details that draw on the five senses. So what the character can see, what the character can hear, what the character can smell, and what the character can feel, what they can taste. We're only going to use these details as appropriate to help the reader visualize the scene. Setting can be done in two ways. We can just tell our reader what they're looking at, like our example from The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, nor yet a dry, very sandy hole. We know exactly what we're looking at here because the author is specifically telling us what to see. Another example is we could simply tell them what they're seeing. Bob was scared. We know Bob's scared now. Okay, that's telling. More interesting, and what will pull your reader in and make them think more about what you're writing, is showing, where you're giving them enough detail to actually experience what's going on in this story. For example, it was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. We're starting to imagine the things that mean comfort to us and how they could fit into a hole. Or Bob's face went ashen. His breath came in ragged gasps. Again, we know that Bob is scared because he's got this pasty face and he's breathing hard. That's showing us instead of just telling us. So we want to use these two elements to let our reader know exactly where they're at, but also to incorporate them into the scene so that as they're reading, they're moving through our imaginary space with us as a tour guide. Setting anchors our characters and readers in time and place. It's going to help them understand and experience what's happening in our stories. So it's important that we make sure to include it not just in our planning, but also in our writing.